The day of the crossing dawned like a held breath. Mist lay over the green fork so thick it seemed the river had devoured the sky, and when the wind slid along the banks, it lifted torn veils of white that snagged on rushes and willow switches and the broken teeth of old pilings. The twins loomed above all that silence, two squat keeps linked by stone and timbers, their banners limp in the damp, the paint that marked their grimacing bridge faces beaded with the night's wet. Men who had sung through the dark fell quiet as the morning seeped into their bones. Horses stamped to keep life in their legs. Armor took the chill and passed it on, turning shoulders into slabs of cold iron and making every strap a stiff, uncooperative thing. Somewhere in the fog a heron cried and was answered only by the river slapping its own banks. Robb Stark sat his horse with the patience of a man raised by winters, watching his breath and the geldings mingle until they vanished. He wore no crown. It lay wrapped in oilcloth in a chest with other burdens, among them a parchment that had brought word of Stannis' wreck at the Blackwater, and another with the cold, practiced script of Tywin Lannister, whispering that the South had decided itself already. He could feel the weight of those letters even now, though they were out of sight. A king's weight was not metal upon the head. It was ink seeping into every choice until no choice felt truly one's own. Catelyn came up beside him, wool pulled tight and fox fur turned high, so that only the ridge of her brow and the sharp intelligence of her eyes showed clear. She had never feared mists, never believed that the world hid monsters in ordinary weather, only men. The damp had tamed her hair to dark copper threads and softened the lines at her mouth. She looked toward the twins as a woman might look at an old wound. Not to admire it, but to understand it, to measure its healing or its stubbornness. He will keep the words he has flung at us, she said. And the fog carried them, made them gentle. Your pride must not answer his. My pride will not, Robb said, and he meant it. My duty will. Duty is a hard thing to marry, Catelyn said, and then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Yet it can be faithful, if you are. He felt gray wind before he heard him. The great direwolf padded from the mist like a piece of it given muscle and fang. Coat roughened by the wet, eyes the color of winter mornings in the wolfswood. Men drew quiet in a different way when gray wind came. They made space around him without thinking, a seam opening in the cloth of the crowd. Robb reached down and buried his hand in the wolf's ruff. The heat there was steadier than any he had known since he'd crossed the neck. It traveled up his arm and into his chest, and it reminded him of fires banked for the night. Sleeping, not dead. Walder Frey will prick himself upon his own tongue one day. The great yawn boomed behind them. Mayhaps even today, if the gods are merciful. He smelled of ale and victory long past and yet to come, of leather and old smoke. He always did, but he'll not prick us if we watch his hands. Roose Bolton's pale gaze slid over the river's surface and returned to the bridge. He had not drawn up so close as the others. He sat his pale horse like a statue carved from a cold, pale stone. He seemed untroubled by fog. Lord Walder understands guest right, he said softly. He will not hazard that reputation for a jest. He understands what flints he can strike without fire, Catelyn said. He understands what he can say and still pretend to have not said it. And he understands the value of a promise kept, Robb said. We came to hold ours. He saw the moment the gate mouth darkened with movement, and then shapes took the color of men. Frey men-at-arms first, halberds upright, then the salt-white face of Walder's bridge carved into human shape. Lord Walder himself came no further than the arch shadow. His nose was as thin and sharp as a prior's tool. His lips made a straight, stingy line. Time had not so much worried him as dried him. He had been set in the sun like a fish to toughen. But when he bowed correctly, and when he spoke, though his words clipped, they did not stumble. King in the North, he said, if that is still what you are, and not merely some lost wolf with ivy in his fur. We have had wet nights. You bring the wet with you. The North wears weather whether you curse it or no, the great John rumbled. But Catelyn's gloved hand against his forearm made him a quieter mountain. Robb reined forward just enough. Lord Walder, you have my thanks for opening your gates. And you have mine for remembering that a Frey is not a servant to be summoned by finger, Walder said. His gaze snicked like a knife point from Robb to Catelyn and back. You bring a mother. You bring a wolf. You bring 1,000 hungry mouths that will pick my good dry bones. Very well. We shall see if we can scrape a feast from mildew. You come to honor your oath. The last word he tasted, then spit, as if it were something he had stepped in. I do, Robb said, and felt the shape of the decision sit within him with the same rightness as a sword properly sheathed. I do. Walder's mouth twitched, then cross. King in the north, we shall find you a daughter who will not sour milk when she walks by it. They crossed. The river spoke beneath the bridge in a steady murmur, like a patient scolding, like a long memory. The Frey men watched with the unsentimental attention of tradesmen, who knew exactly what their wares were worth, and had no interest in hearing stories about them. The banners hung along the approach were painted with quarterings upon quarterings. Children of children. They had taken on river damp, and their colors had done what river colors do, softened, wrung themselves into one another without quite losing their lineage. The keep smelled of old stones and clean rushes, of stale onion, and the faint, sour ghost of spilled ale. The twins had always dared the river to swallow them, and the river had not yet found a way. But the river had marked its try along every sill and lintel. Inside, the air was warmer and heavier. Torches dripped and spat. The oily smoke kissed the rafters and lingered. Walder's brood assembled in stages, as if the hall itself gave birth to them. The older sons, leathered, paunchy, eyes that counted, took up the places that habit told them were theirs. The daughters and granddaughters moved like schools of fish that had learned to swim within nets. There were Freys who looked like one another without being able to be told apart, and Freys who looked like no one at all, as if some ancestor had mated with the wind and the child had insisted on keeping that strange inheritance. Through it all, Lord Walder sat like the knot at the center of a rope, and every thread led to him and was looped around him and would not slip unless he allowed it. Robb stood and listened to the words that bound and were meant to bind. He had thought, in the long hours of the march, about love and the way it had snared him once, about how the snare had been his own making and had caught him precisely because he had wanted it to. He had thought about the way a careless hour could be the stone that started an avalanche. He had thought about the faces of men who counted on him as a roof over their heads and a wall between them and winter. It left him empty of pride and full of clarity. The Septon's voice washed around him, and he spoke when he was meant to speak, not as an actor or a boy repeating lines, but as a man laying planks under his own feet to cross a chasm. The girl they gave him to wed had a face that remembered summers. Rosalind they called her, and it was a small musical name that did not snag in the mouth. She was slender enough that he wondered if parts of the world were forever scraping her away, and yet would not succeed. Her hair was the color of straw glaze on river stones. When she lifted her eyes to his, he saw not fear but a carefulness, the carefulness of one who had learned to read rooms like maps and men like weather. Her hands did not tremble when he took them. When she said the words, she looked at him as if a bird were settling, very light, very watchful, ready to fly if she must but willing to stay, if he proved not to be a scarecrow that would startle at every gust. Later he would think of that look and be grateful for it, because it had contained both candor and grace. Walder watched, and Catelyn watched Walder. Grey Wind stood nearest the boy who had brought him meat when they first entered, and then had not dared to touch him again. The wolf was courteous to fear and indifferent to boldness, as wolves are. Robb bound himself to Rosalind with the taste of smoke on his tongue and a quiet inside him that he had not expected. The Septon's ribbon scratched the backs of their hands. It was rough wool, serviceable, not meant to beautify but to mark. When they kissed, it was brief and unassuming. Salt and breath, the soft clatter of the hall beyond them continuing as if they were two pebbles, dropped in a wide, moving stream. Feasting lifted around them after, as if all that restraint had been a lid finally pried up. The hall shook itself like a dog after river crossing. Platters passed quickly as coins, and hands were frank in their hunger. The minstrels found their strings and beat the damp out of them, and the songs came proud and coarse, about bears and maidens and old kings who had won fights that never happened. Children, Freys or men's get made elsewhere and claimed here, darted among the benches as if the hall itself had begotten them, as if they were the hall's thoughts given legs and laughter. Walder's eyes followed them when they went near the head table, not with affection, but with arithmetic. His blood, his accounts. "Rosalind," Catelyn said when custom allowed, and Rosalind was brought to her. "I am Catelyn Stark." There were 1,000 ways she might have said it, coldly, warmly, with surrender, or with battle in it. She chose none of those, and all of them. She spoke her name as if it were a thing standing up by itself, needing no props. "My lady," Rosalind said, and curtsied low, a ripple in gray-blue wool that had been made to flatter without boasting. "I have admired your strength from stories." Stories sometimes lie, but not always. "Not always," Catelyn said. The fox fur at her shoulders warmed with the press of bodies in the hall. "Stories are the bones of truths and sometimes the meat. You have given my son your hand." "I have," Rosalind said. "He has given me habit and hope. I think perhaps I have not held something so heavy before." "Mandawand." "It will get heavier," Catelyn said. "And let that bleakness be what it was." Then she softened it. "But you will get stronger." Rosalind's smile was not quick and sweet as some girls were. It was deliberate, and that made it more truthful. "I am not certain Lord Walder intended that as a gift," she said. "Lord Walder seldom gives without keeping the ribbon," Catelyn said. "Do not be fooled by any pretty bow. They drank for alliances and for the river's forbearance and for bridges that stood and would stand. The great John, who could be cajoled into tears by certain lays when sufficiently drunk, thumped his mug on the table and bellowed for a northern tune that had sent men pounding their shields against their own ribs once." Roose Bolton did not speak more than he must, but his eyes traveled, a pale moth in a dim place, finding corners to haunt. The blackfish came late from speaking with men who had watched the fords in the night, and when he sat his bones had the weary ease of an old archer who has learned to relax exactly as much as the bow allows between shots. Robb watched the Freys watch him, and because he was young and had been made older, he did not pretend that their glances were love. He had paid a debt. That he would receive coin for it he did not doubt. Lord Walder had no piety for its own sake, but coin is not a vow. Men break coin. The coin breaks men. He ate because hunger does not care if you are king. He drank because his throat was sore with words. He smiled because faces cannot be grim all the time and remain human. When at last they left the hall and climbed the twist of stairs to the chamber set aside for them, he felt as if the keep itself pushed at his back, urging him on. The chamber smelled of old rushes and the faint iron breath of the river, but there had been lavender spread among the reeds, and a brazier smoldered the damp away. Rosalind turned her back to him without artifice and held up her hair with both hands so that he could unlace the gown. He had been young enough once to make fumbling into a kind of charm. He was not that boy anymore. His hands were deft with armor. They found a gentleness with cloth. "Does it frighten you," she asked, "to sleep where so many have slept, to climb into a bed heavy with other people's stories?" "It would if I were a scholar," he said. "I am only a soldier. Stories do not make me sneeze. They only make me quiet." He hesitated. "I have been careless in this once. I will not be again. Yet I have not forgotten how to be tender." Her hair slid like river grass through his fingers. "I am glad you remember something other than orders," she said. After, while the brazier ticked, and the river muffled its own voice as if even water knew when to be discreet, he lay with one hand behind his head and the other on the sheet where her warmth lingered, as if he could learn from the heat and the absence both. He did not pretend a love he had not had time to grow. He did not deny the peace that had come. Her breathing settled into the long, reliable cadence of trust, and he did not take that lightly. Dawn found them not quite intertwined, but arranged like two things that had learned one another's edges in the night and elected not to bruise. A knock came that aimed to be respectful and landed somewhere between urgent and patient. When Robb bid it enter, A young Frey with anxious freckles told him a council waited. "Walder does not sleep," Caitlin said, appearing behind the boy as if shadows conspired in her favor. "He only rests his malice." At the council table, maps were unrolled with the reverence men gave to saints' bones. The riverlands lay there like a body that had been carried too long. Bruised, swelling in some parts, hollowed in others, stitched up with false, hurried seams. The north crouched above them, present not by drawing. Those great white reaches were mostly blank, but by gravity. Robb set his palms on the table and thought of the way the world bent toward home, even when men marched away from it. "The neck holds us," the blackfish said, tapping the causeways with a finger that had lived half its life on bowstrings. "Moat Cailin is a stopper. Pull it, and we can pour north if that's your aim. Leave it, and the Ironborn squat above us and laugh." "River Run still needs holding," Edmure said. He looked younger this morning than he had last night, as if laughter had rinsed him. "Laughing men may sit their bog until their legs go numb. Lannisters do not laugh so easily. They will laugh when they read the ravens about the Blackwater," Roose murmured, "and they will sharpen their knives when they have done laughing. The Tyrell rose has thorns," the Great John snorted. "We felt them none, but we will, if we turn our backs to the south and bare our arses." "Let us not bear anything to anyone," Caitlin said. "Let us not be drawn into pride the way girls are drawn into dances they did not choose." Robb listened. He had learned to listen past men's insistences to the shape of their fears underneath, as a hunter listens past the wind to the sound of a stag picking its hooves. He knew the south had thickened against him. He knew the sea had brought strange men into his father's halls and left ash there. He knew there were names on his tongue that tasted of loss. And one of them was Bran, and one of them was Rickon, and one of them was Winterfell itself. Helplessness was a weed that sprouted wherever those names were said. He would not let it take root here too. "We have sworn Roslin, and through her, Lord Walder," he said, "because speaking the alliance made it firmer underfoot. We have given offense nowhere. We hold the twins. We hold the river crossings with Frey men in our reckoning." He let his finger travel from that narrow waist to where the map widened and then narrowed again. "We cannot break the south by hammering, but the north is ours by right and memory. The men there will not settle under krakens or lions if we go to them. The sea does not love the neck. The krakens know it little. We will take back Moat Cailin. We will go home. From there, if the south wants to march and learn the taste of snow, we can teach it." "Sign." Edmure's mouth made a shape that was not quite a frown. "And River Run?" "Blackfish, can you hold it?" Robb asked. "I have held worse with less," Brynden Tully said. He scratched where his beard met his jaw, a thoughtful rasp. "I'll need men, and grain, and a lord who does not decide to be clever without telling me." Edmure had the grace to look at the table and then laugh at himself. "I am not always clever, uncle. Sometimes I only think I am." "Send Ser Helman Talhart to the west bank," Robb said. "Bolster Seaguard. Malisters are stout. They know the sea's tricks. Let the Freys keep their own house. Let us not thin ourselves to a whisper. Roose." He let his voice soften, "because men sometimes tell you more when they are certain you do not suspect them of wanting to. What men can you spare that will not pine for the Dreadfort if they do not see it by winter?" Roose's eyes were still. "The pining of my men has never concerned me. I will give you 600 spears and 400 archers, and I will take my own road through the east of the neck and worry the Ironborn from the sides." "Then Matund, you will worry them with patience and knives," the Great John said. "Not exactly approving, and not exactly not. I will worry them with whatever worries them," Roose said. Walder Frey had not sat at the table at first. He came then, slow, with a cane that he did not need so much as enjoy tapping against things. He listened, his mouth alive with small satisfactions that did not require the rest of his face. "You go north," he said at last, "leaving your wife with me. A son of mine might think that a prize and mistake her for one. I take my wife with me," Robb said. "I do not leave my king's peace in other men's pockets." Walder snorted, pleased despite himself by the insolence kept within bounds. "She is mine," he said, gloating only as much as was his habit. Now she is yours as well. I will not have her caught in your marches and pitched tents like a comb fallen under a mule's foot. She will be safe with us, Caitlin said, and there was iron under the words. Nothing is safe, Walder said. Not even old men from coughing. He looked at Rosalind then, as if he were tallying her ribs for meat. She did not flinch. If you must drag her through swamps and dreams, do it quickly, and do not expect me to sob if the mud keeps a shoe. Robb met Rosalind's eyes and found none of the theatrical bravery men sometimes demand for their own comfort. He found a steadiness that might put roots down in any soil. Do you wish to ride? He asked her later, when the faces were done and the hall had dimmed, and the business of war had wandered to find its own bed. I wish to be where you are, she said. Not because of vows only, because a woman who does not learn the weather her husband walks in will drown in the first storm she meets. Then we shall see the weather together, he said, and found that saying it made some inner knot pass through and loosen. They did not break camp for 2 days while the Frey men, who understood the river's timings as well as their lord understood a fence, made the crossings as efficiently as a miller moves grain. The army at rest was like a field left fallow. There was noise in it, a hum of mending, of cooking, of grumbling, of courting and cards. And there was a quiet in it too. Men told stories with their hands while tying knots. Women boiled linen until the steam made ghosts above the cauldrons. The smith's hammers set a rhythm that steadied more than metal. Gray wind ranged and returned, accepting some hands, rejecting others, making his own determinations of trust, as dogs and kings do. Rosalind walked where she could be seen and where she could see in turn. She let the camp measure her, and she measured it. Men who had wives looked at her and thought of home. Men who did not looked at her and thought of things they could not name properly. Women looked at her and considered where threads might be cut and where they might be tied. Caitlin spoke with Mallister men and with the Frey daughters, who would not meet her gaze, and with one of Walder's wives, whose eyes were a soft, tired blue, and who remembered the names of every child she had borne, and every child she had lost, with an accuracy that put maesters to shame. Duty, Caitlin thought later as she stood at the edge of the river and watched a barge nose its way under the bridge, is not heavy because it is cruel. It is heavy because it never sets itself down. They marched north under a sky that changed its mind every hour. The causeways across the neck rose like reluctant truths from the bog, narrow gray tongues of stone that felt older than the quarrels of kings. The army thinned itself to pass them. Men grew quiet on those stretches. The world shrank to road and fog, and the knowledge of water not far, black, under green. Crannogmen watched them from reeds as still as herons, and sometimes a man would swear he had seen a face just there in the scum, a pale oval with cattail hair, but by the time his companion looked, nothing moved except gnats. Scouts came and went with the speed of dark thoughts. They brought word of ironborn raiding parties sniffing along the lakes, of villages that had been asked for food, and had given it with the compliance born of a calculation rather than fear, of tracks that were not men's and not wolves. Robb let the information lay itself in his mind, the way snow lays itself on pine boughs, delicate until a branch could bear no more, and then falling in a soft, absolute hiss. At night, fires showed men their own faces better than mornings did. Robb took his meals in the open when he could, because he had learned his father's lesson, that a lord who hides at his table also hides from truth. He spoke to men from the Barrowlands and to a boy from the rills whose ears stuck out so far that he could hear it when men whispered about him. He made the boy laugh once, and the boy laughed as if he had been forgiven something that had not been a sin. He heard a woman from the Manderley kitchen sing a song about baking that had more salt in it than flour and made the great John snort beer. Rosalind learned those faces too, and the rhythms of their speech, and the first time she took a ladle and served stew with her own hands, the line grew longer. Not because the stew had changed, but because men wanted to tell their wives later that the new queen had put meat into their bowls herself. Gray wind hunted and returned with burrs in his fur that Robb picked out patiently, one by one, while speaking of marches with Galbart Glover. He knows something, Glover said, and meant Roose Bolton. What he knows, he does not share. One day he will tell us. and it will be too late to do anything but say we always suspected it. N.C. Suspicion is winter's favorite game, Robb said. It keeps us warm without warming anything. Better that than frostbite of the heart, Glover said, and spat into the fire so that it hissed and curled on itself, and then decided to be fire again. On the fourth day from the twins, a raven came out of the late light with the twisty insistence of a thought that will not be shaken loose. It settled on the arm of a Malister man who had once been nimble with hawks and had not forgotten how to be gentle with a bird's bones. The ribbon at the raven's leg was a green so deep it was almost black. The wax bore the impression of a merman's trident. Wyman Manderley did nothing small. Robb read the letter with the carefulness he had learned from his father, not gobbling sense as if it were a crust of bread. He felt Caitlin beside him like a second sight. He did not mind it. Manderley's script sprawled like a comfortable man in a chair, yet it did not waste space. It spoke of White Harbor's holdings and of ships that knelt to storms to survive them, and of men who had died and men who had not, and of bread and salt, of oaths, of the way a man's word might be eaten and made bone, and then be part of him, and not be scavenged back out again, even with sharp tools. It offered men more than Robb had dared to expect, and grain, and something else less tangible and more nourishing, a promise that he was remembered in those high-windowed halls where candles kissed their own smoke. Bread and salt, Caitlin said, almost to herself. I do not think Lord Walter knows how badly he would taste if he were to be eaten. Do not borrow treachery, Robb said. There will be enough to pay for without going into debt. That night he dreamed, or thought he dreamed, of the Godswood at Winterfell. It came to him not as it had been on the day of his father's death news, not as it had been in boys' summers when he had put his hands against the heart tree and felt nothing but bark and his own impatience, but as something he hadn't known he knew. The smell of green water, the way leaf shadows move on stone. He heard a boy's laughter somewhere and could not place it inside a memory. Gray Wind lifted his head once in the dark and made a sound like an answer, and like a question both. At Moat Cailin the land itself narrowed the world to an argument. The ruins lifted out of the bog like black teeth. 3 keeps slumped into ruin, towers charred in stories so old that men tell them to warm themselves and to warn their sons. Walls melted by the ages into the shapes of things that had resisted them. The Ironborn had no love of land, but they had love of leverage. They held the causeway from those broken stones like a man might hold an enemy by the ankle and keep his head underwater without making a show of it. Their raiders had carved the faces of dead seabirds into the wet wood of their shield rims. The bird eyes looked glad to be rid of the sky. Their laughter carried strangely over water, like knives tinkling together in a bundle. Robb did not throw men against the keeps like stones at crows. He knew the neck would eat armies as quickly as it would spit them out again. He set his men on raised hummocks, and he built walkways where there were none. And he let the Crannogmen do their work. They slid through the reed beds like rumors, and returned with news that smelled of eel and moss. They taught the Freys how to move without making every frog within a mile throw itself into the water shrieking. They showed Manderley spears, who had come faster than their letter had, where to thrust the poles that tested ground, so that the man behind would not vanish waist deep in some green lie, and have to be dragged out like a drowning calf. At dusk on the third day, a man came to Robb's fire who wore leather that had forgotten what dye it once held. He had hair the color of sump water and eyes so mild they made men distrust him. He walked like someone who did not often have to declare his presence, and who had learned long ago that silence is a stronger announcement than many words. He looked at Caitlin first and bowed as if bowing were not a habit, but a decision he enjoyed making. "My lady," he said, "your father taught me to choose my knees wisely." "Howland," Caitlin breathed. And the name was a thing pulled from a long winter trunk and found to be not moth-eaten after all. Her voice gentled. "You waited until the bog swallowed 5 of my boy's boots, and then you showed yourself." "4," he said. "The 5th man only has wet feet. He will complain as if a fish had bit him, but he will not sicken. He is built like a mallard." Robb stood. He had heard the name as boys hear names they know they will never meet. Not with awe exactly, but with the sense that certain stories exist to be true, even if they never touch your hand. "Howland Reed," he said. "Your father was taller," Reed said, not unkindly. "But you are less proud with your height." They sat, and the marsh pressed up around them and listened like an old grandmother who had grown fond of her own eavesdropping. Reed spoke in the way of men who do not like to waste meat. He cut the matter away from its skin and left enough fat to cook with. The Ironborn had made strong their holds where strong did not mean beautiful. Their captains had the petty squabbles of all men, and one of them had taken a river woman and kept her in a tower room where the wind never reached. They were sure of the causeways because stone is arrogant and bog is not. They had angered something that lived in a pool so deep that when the Cranagmen described it, they did not use numbers, but old hand signs. "I can give you their tongues," Reed said, and meant their gossip, their speech. "I can give you their dinners so late their bellies will scold them. I cannot give you the stones. The stones still prefer the sea. We will pry the sea's fingers one by one," Robb said. "We will not ask it to release the whole hand at once." "Good," Reed said. "Men who demand the whole hand are eaten to the wrist." Roose Bolton listened and did not smile, but allowed his eyes to become thinner, which was as close as he came. "My men," he said, "will take the east approach and set traps. The Ironborn are brave in straight lines. We will make their strides crooked." "Medine, do not sit too long with the water at your backs," Caitlin told him. "I never do," he said. His courtesy was polished to a dull sheen, the way a blade gets when used to pry and scrape rather than to cut. He turned then and looked out where the torches made fat coins on the black. "We will starve them, and when they fish, we will remind the fish not to be generous." The first night of their patient siege, rain came that was less rain than a decision the sky made to sweat. It found every seam in men's clothes and crept there and made a home. Torches burned with low, resentful flames, like men asked to do work beneath them. The songs men sang were shorter and dirtier and more stubborn. Robb went among the tents with Rosalind at his side, and the rain made her hair cling to her head and made her eyelashes into black spokes. She did not complain. She took bread from a basket and broke it with her hands and passed it around. When the last loaf was gone, she looked at her palms, wet and covered with crumbs and stuck with salt, and wiped them on her gown without flinching. "Bread and salt," a Manderley man said, and his voice had that soft, fat joy that northern men have when they know they are doing something correct and old. "Bread and salt," Rosalind repeated, as if tasting a language for the first time and finding it good. Robb slept badly and woke with a recollection that was not quite his own. The smell of wet dog and old wood smoke. The feel of a small hand against his cheek. He lay there and let the soft, confusing homesickness move through him, and then settle somewhere he could carry it. When morning came clean and thin, like a new knife, he called his captains and set the day's teeth. Bolton's men moved like fog inside fog, pale blurs that only stepped fully into being when required. The Great John's roars patrolled the lines better than 10 men could have. Men on the brink of folly pulled back from it for fear of being made a story in his mouth. Cranagmen swam where men do not like to even imagine swimming, and came up under rafts to place knives where ropes held. The Ironborn were not cowards. They came out to contest and died hard, and the sound of them dying had something merry in it that made even brave men uneasy. Twice Robb's spear line buckled, and twice he held it with his voice and with his presence, which are different weapons and both need sharpening if they are to be any use. It was on the 7th day that a thing happened which would later be told many ways, but which at the time was only this. A small boat came darting like a water insect toward the northernmost ruin, and inside it was a boy, scab-kneed, hair like wet straw, eyes that always looked as if they had just come from laughing even if he had not. He carried over his lap a white cloth, and beneath it there was the shape of something that might have been offerings or might have been a trap. A Frey archer drew on him and might have put an arrow through his throat for caution's sake if Howland Reed had not reached out with his staff and knocked the bow a hair's width. The arrow vanished into the water and was swallowed as if it had never been made. The boy slid his boat to the stones and lifted the cloth. He had eels there, fat and glossy, and apples, and 2 loaves so fresh that steam still made promises above them. He held them up in a voice, "Woman's hard," called down from the ruined tower in a language that was not theirs. The boy shouted back and made obscene gestures with a kind of fine, gentle cheer. The woman swore again, but after a pause, rope came down. The food went up. The rope went up. The boy pushed away with his foot and grinned at the men who had been about to kill him. He grinned as if they were all complicit in the same joke, which, in a way, they were. The boy returned at dusk with a second boat, and in that boat was a man with a bag over his head, and his hands bound, and a crude crown burned into his shoulder. The Ironborn paid for bread and salt with hostages and pride. Men make such bargains when patience has been chewed to the pith. Robb bled them of hours. He bled them of patience. He did not throw his men away. He wrote to Manderley, to ready White Harbor, for an influx of men who would eat more than salt cod, and who would smell of marsh long after they had been bathed. He wrote to Mage Mormont, and to Lord Serwyn's heir, and to anyone whose fidelity was not to crowns, but to hearths. And he asked for wood, and for women who could card wool, and fetch water in men's shirts without complaint. War's cleverest quartermasters. He wrote to Galbart Glover, who he had not sent ahead after all, because he found he did not want Glover's good sense anywhere but where his own eyes could see it. He wrote to Rosalind's hand as well, the letters quieter, the lines fewer, even when she sat opposite him beside the same fire. He wrote to something not yet made of habit in him, something he feared might be as fragile as new ice, but wanted to test with the weight of honest words. Caitlin watched him when he did not know she was watching, and she watched the lines at his mouth that were becoming a man's and not a boy's. She wrote too. She wrote to River Run, and to a sister who would not read, and to the part of herself that could not mother a king, and still insist upon him remembering to sleep. She spoke with Rosalind more than once in words that were not instruction, but were not entirely not. She told her the names of northern constellations that men in the south did not bother with, and she explained why you must never let a smith be slighted, and she taught her how to knot hair to keep it dry in a long rain, which is as practical as any lesson in statecraft. On the 12th day, a storm rose from the east, with a scold on its tongue. It pushed rain like a broom and turned the ground to what Cranagmen call speechless mud, which is the sort that does not tell you where your foot will go when you set it. Ironborn looked to their elders and found those elders frowning, because sea storms few of them understood and bog storms fewer. Bolton's men had set their traps too cleverly for the Ironborn to remember all of them. The first wave of raiders tangled in ropes that did not seem to be there until they were and pitched into water that held them as a miser holds coin. The second wave fared worse because it leaped to help the first. By the time the storm rolled its back and decided to go scold somewhere else, a third of the Ironborn garrison had been eaten by the neck, not as an indulgence, but as a simple regular meal. The captain within the northern ruin sent down a man with a flag, white, as custom demanded, though it had clearly been a shirt once. He had hollowed himself from his own ribs. He stood like a fence that had been taken down and propped against a wall, with the intention of putting it up again later, and then forgetting. He wanted parley. Robb met him on a spit of ground that pretended to be solid with the unconvincing confidence of men who lie badly. "I can hold this place until winter," the captain said. He was fair, and his beard was braided with little bone pins that knocked one another together when he swallowed. "You will lose 100 men for every 5 I must. The bog loves me as it hates you." "The bog is a poor lover," Robb said. He did not say more. He let the Cranagmen's faces and the faded patience of his own stand for words. "Lay down arms, walk out in your shirts. Leave the banners. I will let you live." "Men who walk out without banners have already died," the captain said. "The drowned god does not speak well of those who slink. Your god loves salt," Howland Reed said, not unkindly. "But he does not love it so much that he will be pleased to see it wasting in the tears of your wives. Pride is a fire that keeps no one warm." "You would have us slink," the captain said again. More to himself, "I would have you go home," Robb said, "and carry the word that the north is not for you." They haggled, as men will even with honor. At last they agreed. The Ironborn walked out in their shirts. One of them, a boy with a nose broken long ago, wept and grinned, while he did so with the shame of men who have never had to choose between living and their story of themselves. The banners were left. The towers were given back. Not rebuilt, only returned to the custody of men who knew their grudges better. Robb watched them file by and did not gloat. He had learned from his father that victory is a guest and must be fed, but must not be made comfortable enough to nap at your table. Men cheered anyway because men must. Rosalind did not cheer aloud, but her eyes lifted in a way that was its own victory. When the causeways were theirs, and the bog had stopped tugging at their shoes with quite the same greed, they began the long, patient pull north. It felt then like walking uphill to something that lay flat and white in memory. The north always feels uphill to those who belong to it. The air changed its teeth. Men who had grown used to rot and gnat clouds drew breath as if they had been underwater and were now allowed up. The first night out of the neck, the sky cleared all at once in the small hours, leaving black so thick it felt like cloth pulled taut over them, and stars so sharp that even Rosalind, who had been taught to lower her eyes, lifted them and kept them lifted until they watered. White Harbor reached to them with smells even before its walls came into sight. Fish, certainly, and tar and wet rope, and that high sugar smell that always clings to cities that bake, as if some grandmother god is making loaves in every stone oven at once. Manderley's banners were handsome and pompous, which had always been part of their charm. The gates opened as if for a feast in an old story. Men poured in with a roar that was half hunger and half relief. Women stood on steps with baskets of coarse bread and split fish, and little cups of sharp beer that cut through the marsh, the way vinegar cuts through the taste of too much oil. In the square of fishmongers, a child saw Grey Wind and ran, laughing terror, to hide behind her mother's skirt. Grey Wind turned his head so that the child could see one eye and not the teeth. Wyman Manderley received them upon a chair that had been made to remind men of what chairs are for. Comfort, yes, but also display. He was a man who took up his space without apology, and who had learned to make appetite into a virtue, rather than a jeered sin. He rose slowly from that chair, and the slow rising was its own ceremony. "Your Grace," he said, and the words boomed like a drum, and the chamber remembered them. "Lord Manderley," Robb said. They exchanged courtesies that were not simply courtesies. They were the steps of a dance men had learned, so that they might know what to do with their hands while the room watches. Manderley looked at Rosalind and bowed without rummaging through her as Walter had, and because of that she felt safer and stood straighter. "Bread and salt," Manderley said. And servants brought trays heavy with both. "We are not the South. We do not forget." It was in White Harbor that the first true good sleep found the army. Beds felt like treason to men who had learned to think of sleep as an enemy's trick. They softened at last. The forges sang like agreeable drunkards. Letters went out as naturally as breath. The maesters were busy, but without the frantic edge of triage. Caitlin stood at a window one afternoon and watched a boy trying to teach a younger boy to skip stones on the fingers of water that chopped against the quay. The younger boy did not yet understand when to let go. His stone thumped and sank. The older boy showed him again. Patience is not kindness only, she thought. It is a kind of fierceness that refuses to let the right way be bullied by the quick way. Robb met with men who had held Winterfell's memory better than Winterfell had held its own stones. They spoke of foes who had worn his father's hall like a poor-fitting cloak and of smoke that had taught the sky a new, ugly color. They spoke the names of those they had lost, as if setting them in a line and asking them to be counted. They asked him with different words and the same hope, if he meant to go home. "I do," he said, each time. "I do," in the deep of a night that had turned its face toward morning, with that shy, trembling change that nights perform in the north. Robb woke with the sensation of standing in snow that did not bite. It was not a dream. It was a gift. He felt his father's hand on his head as if he were still a boy, and that hand could still absolve and direct. He did not weep. He put his palms over his eyes and saw a red leaf against white, and then he slept again and did not dream. Letters came from the south in other hands. It was said in one that Robb had been named traitor again, as if nothing were new in the world, and only the seal changed. Another carried courtesy from a southern lord, who thought to suggest peace the way men suggest that a busy market might go quieter if all the vendors were to agree to stop shouting at once. A third was in a woman's hand, careful and strange, offering some marriage no one wanted, and some alliance that would never grow fruit in northern soil. Robb read them and put them aside. Some he burned. The heat of them was not nothing. He used what heat there was. Rosalind learned the harbor as a woman learns a new kitchen. She let the fishwives teach her which cod were best for drying, and she listened to why you must not beat the laundry in certain parts of the river. And she learned the names of men who pull their rafts through the shallows, and how you can tell by the set of their mouths whether a storm is 2 days or 4. Some women turned toward her with their jawbones set and waited to be offended. They were not. She watched them as if they were worth watching. She did not flinch at blood or filth. She did not pretend she had not been raised in a house where salt was counted. She did not apologize for her father to them. She apologized for herself when she needed to. It made her both harder and more beloved than she would have been had she tried to please everyone. Caitlin, who had long ago learned that pleasing everyone is the least pleasing thing one can attempt, found herself staring sometimes and then smiling despite herself. From White Harbor, north is not a direction, but a decision. They made it, and the decision made them in turn. The road to Winterfell is a necklace of small towns and stretches where the world goes wide and quiet. Men forget how far one can see across snow, until they are there, and then they remember that the sky is a lid you can pick up. The weather found them and tested them, and then grudgingly allowed them to pass. At Barrowton, they met men who had slept in burial mounds and taken counsel from bones. Not because of sorcery, but because men will speak to anything that has learned to be still long enough to listen. At the Hornwood, they heard the fox's complaint against whatever new thing had taken to their woods with bright axes. In deserted crofts, they found all the signs men leave behind when they leave fast. A toy carved from driftwood with a smile too wide, a copper pan polished by use, a basket with the first round of a handle woven and then stopped because the hand weaving it had been taken. They caught iron-born raiding parties and taught them what land fight's like when it is loved by the men who catch you. They ran down a band of reavers with boar tusks set into their helmets, who looked about them with the dismay of sailors forced to admit the earth is not flat. They hanged the leader not because hanging pleases the gods, but because it pleases men. And men must be pleased sometimes, or they will do worse things to get their feelings to quiet. Robb watched the man dance and did not find triumph in it. He found only the subtraction of one trouble from the sum of many. Roose Bolton's letters came thin as knife blades. He wrote of flayed banners raised where raiders had been caught, and of the way fear can be harvested like a winter crop if you know how to keep it from rotting. He wrote of his bastard with a detached fondness, as a smith might write of a hammer that has not yet failed him. Robb read those lines with care and folded them with care as well, and when he set them aside, he put a stone on them so the wind would not lift their corners and make them speak again on their own. They came at last to Winterfell's smoke-black bones. The snow there had preserved the shape of what had been. It filled niches and lay on ledges and made level places where there had been hollows. The hall's great timbers lifted against the sky like ribs in a whale grave. Men stood in the yard that had taught them to wheel and halt, and felt themselves become boys without warning, as if the very stones had kept their young names. The weirwood's red leaves rattled like paper. Its face, not carved by a careful hand, but by the age of such hands, looked down and did not blink. The gods do not care for pity. They care for attention. Robb did not fall to his knees. He stood. He stood until the cold went through him and came out the other side and took something he had been carrying that he did not need and left something he did. He reached out and put his palm on a stone that had once been part of a door and was now only itself. "Home," he said, and the men around him said nothing because there are fewer words for that than men think. They set to work. Winterfell does not rebuild itself. Men who had forgotten they knew how to thatch remembered. Masons who had felt useless found that hands learn faster than despair. Women took measure of what could be boiled and what must be roasted if it was to make bellies quiet. They improvised stews that tasted of gratitude and of cutting corners so expertly that men did not feel cut. Caitlin stood in the godswood and listened to the water and did not ask it questions it would not answer. She thought of girls' laughter that had once bent the air here, and of a man sitting where she sat, who had once been boy and would never be again and would not be any longer. She thought of the way grief becomes furniture. The chair by the fire, the stool by the door, the hook upon which you hang your cloak, the thing you do not speak of that you use every day. Rosalind, who had learned that a lady's hands are not mirrors but tools, took needle and thread and mended with the same attention she had learned to give to men's faces. She found where the walls broke wind and stopped them with wool stuffed into cracks, and with the bodies of men sleeping where they were most useful. She learned to taste snow and tell from it whether it would stay or melt. She learned from a woman older than any story she had been told how to make porridge, that men who thought themselves too proud for porridge consumed without complaint, and even asked for more. She learned the name of a stray cat that a kitchen maid insisted was the reincarnation of some prince from 4 generations back. She greeted the cat by that name and by its other one, the name that meant only that it had a torn ear and did not like to be touched until it did. News came, because news comes. Some of it traveled on feet, some on wings, some on men's tongues that had been paid in coin, and some that had been paid in fear. The South pricked itself on its own politics. Tywin moved pieces with the ineffable calm of men, convinced that pieces are all they deal with. The Freys wrote to say that Lord Walder complained of many things, but not of being wronged. The Karstarks brooded in their own halls, like men sitting in rooms where a window had been nailed shut and the air had turned. Robb sent words that were both order and invitation. Come, bring men, bring wood, bring your grudges and set them down long enough to remember which ones are worth carrying. In the long evenings, men told stories because they had to. Stories were bread when the bread had grown stale. The Greyjohn told one about a bear that had fallen in love with a woodcutter's wife. The bear had done the decent thing and learned to be a man, and the wife had done the decent thing and learned that men make poor bears. Men laughed, and then the laughter folded itself into the corners of the room and slept, and the fire attended to its business of being a fire. Robb sat and listened, and when he laughed, he did not pretend. When he rose to go, he bent to scratch Grey Wind's ear, and Grey Wind leaned into it. And there was a small ordinary rightness in that which had nothing to do with crowns. One night, when the cold had a silver taste to it, as if someone had bitten a coin and then left its residue in the air, Robb and Rosalind walked the inner wall. The snow sang under their boots. The aurora had come, thin, not bragging, like a ribbon thrown up by some giant girl and left there. Green smears above the black timber of the pines. They said little. The words men say to one another when the world has become larger than their choices are weirdly small. They said them anyway. I did not know, Rosalind said, that a place can change the way a heart moves in the body. It is the same heart, Robb said. It is, and yet it beats. To a different drum, she said, seeking for a southern image and not finding it. The air goes in more willingly, even fear. And fear goes in? He asked, amused. Fear goes in, she said, and sits down and does not rustle its skirts like it does in the South. It sits and it listens with everyone else. It understands pots and wood smoke and men coming in with their faces red and their hands raw from rope and ice. It is a northern fear. It minds its manners. He took her gloved hand and felt through it the shape of her fingers as if they were river stones he had been given to hold, and feel their smoothness in the dark. I will not pretend this was a love I was ready for, he said. I broke a vow once. It was not because I despised vows. It was because I forgot I was not the first to want to think myself the exception to their weight. I will not forget again. I am not a punishment. She said. You are not, he said. You are a corrective. She laughed, a small cloud that went before them. You make a husband sound like a sentence. A good sentence sits right in the mouth, he said. A bad one makes you bite your tongue. Somewhere beyond the walls, a wolf answered some moo's command. Grey Wind answered in turn with a sound that began low and stretched itself high like a bow being pulled until the string sings. Men in their beds heard it and slept better. Others heard it and did not. The morning brought a raven splashed with sleet, the mark on its leg smeared but legible. It bore a hand that did not expect to be liked. Roose Bolton's again, clipped and pale. He wrote of the Dreadfort at last, and of a man who had crawled there swearing he had seen two small boys in a forest, alive as embers beneath ash. He wrote of maids who had served a daughter of the Umbers, and of a soldier who had lost 3 fingers, and swore the wind had told him secrets. Men talk, Roose wrote, of ghosts. He wrote it not to comfort, but to disquiet, as men who disquiet by nature will do. Robb read it, and did not let his hands shake. He did not let hope leap like a fish, and break in the cold air. He put the letter aside. He called his mother and showed it to her. She read, and her fingers at first tightened, and then they did not. "Let us not make ourselves foolish," she said. Then she swallowed and added without bitterness, "Let us allow ourselves to be fools if the gods turn out to be kind." "Hope is not a plan," Robb said. "No," Caitlin said, "but it is a map. It shows you where the roads would be if the land were gentler." He set his men about the practical business that hope and dread both demand. He sent for scouts with eyes that knew the difference between deer trails and men's, for women who could ask quiet questions at spinning circles as if they wanted only to borrow a spindle, for boys who could climb with furtive confidence and look into windows as if looking were their only art. He did not send Roose Bolton to fetch children even if they had been ghosts, and even if Roose had asked. Some men, when sent to find the vulnerable, find something else instead. The days folded themselves into work. They mended, they trained, they mended again. There is no glory in mending, and that is why it matters. Snow came in fits and starts. The sun remembered itself, and then forgot. Men took their shirts off to warm themselves by work and shock the air with their steam, and then put on twice as many, and smiled, because the skin is a strange, comic thing that thinks it can argue with weather. Rosalind learned to pull a child's hat down over ears, and to scold in a way that did not seem like scolding. Caitlin learned, as if learning were a thing one had to do anew every day, the exact number of steps from the God's Wood to the Great Hall, and the exact number of breaths a widow takes between rage and prayer. At night, sometimes, Robb took the crown from its cloth and held it, not to admire but to reintroduce himself to its weight. It was cold even near the fire. He thought of the heads of men who had worn it in their minds long before it existed, and of the heads of men who had worn it after it did, and had not found it to fit well. He did not put it on. He did not need it to press its shape into his skin to know he carried it. On a dawn when the world was the color of old pewter, and the sky seemed undecided between righteousness and sulk, a horn sounded from the eastern watch. It did not call alarm. It called attention. A small party moved across the white, unhurried, because haste on snow is merely theater, and ends with men on their backs. Their banner was a bolt of cloth attached to a spear that knew exactly how far to dip, and exactly how far to resist. Above the spear, the air did something that could be mistaken for mirage if you did not know the north. It tightened, as if it had just tasted lemon. "Bolton men," the watchman said, and his lips did not like the shape the words made. Robb went down to the yard because a king should not be told about arrivals within his own fallen walls. Caitlin went also because a mother does not let her son stand in courtyards with pale men and call it only a morning's work. The leader of the party swung down and came forward with that courtesy that hides either respect or contempt, and no one can tell which until later. He bowed. His hair was the soft, colorless brown of wood dried in shadow. His eyes had had the blue boiled out of them long ago, if ever there had been any blue to begin with. "Your Grace," he said, "my lord sends bread and salt." "That is kind," Robb said, and took the packet that was proffered. He broke the bread and ate it, because some things are not dramatics, but necessities. He scattered the salt, and dipped his finger and touched it to his tongue. The man watched this and nodded. "He sends further news," the Bolton man said, and handed over a letter that might as well have been a strip of ice. Robb read it there in the yard. The words were the same few he had expected, only reassembled into a new discomfort. The Dreadfort had received rumor, and then it had received bodies, and the bodies were no proof of anything, except that someone had wanted to make a proof, and had failed at it, or had succeeded in another thing entirely. 2 charred little things claimed to be Bran and Rickon. The char posteriorly whitened the mouth to say so. Men had bent their heads over them and said prayers that had not sounded certain. Winterfell's walls had heard false names before. The letter did not demand comfort. It offered none. It put before him the possibilities like bowls. Choose one to eat from, none of them nourishing. All of them powerfully tempting for being simple. Catelyn's face did not change when she read. It changed afterward, away from the men, in a small room warmed by one brazier set deliberately high. The gods are not so jaunting as to raise lads up for one rumor and lay them down for another, she said. If they are dead, my heart will know it. If they are not, my heart will not be comforted. I cannot tell you which is worse. I will not accept the comfort of despair, Robb said. That comfort is poison that tastes honest because it is bitter. Good, she said, and her mouth made an expression like a smile that did not want to be called that and would scold you if you did. Hold to that. They did not armor themselves in certainty. They made work of uncertainty instead. Men were sent to find the trees with boys' names carved in them, and to ask the trees if they remembered who had made those names. Ravens were sent to Bear Island, because the women there have a smell for lies, and to the Umbers, because the Great John's kin would not allow the world to be simple even if it begged. They were sent to small places no one writes in songs. To a woman who sold buttons and news. To a bearded man at a ferry who only charged half to men who couldn't pay because he enjoyed their gratitude, and then told him more for the pleasure of telling. In the days that followed, Winterfell's yard became a weave of arrivals and departures. It was a shuttle's work, almost homely, if it were not laced with dread and hope both. Two threads that look alike until you hold them up to light. Robb found in himself a stillness that surprised him. He had thought victories would teach him dancing, and defeats would teach him caution. It was the waiting that taught him the patience that is neither of those and both. One evening, when the sky lowered gray and then lowered more, and the men muttered about snow, as if it were a woman they both loved and feared, the Blackfish came to the hall with a light failing, and his beard full of frost. He shook himself like a dog and grinned at Rosalind before he remembered to be a knight and bowed. You look less miserable than a woman brought north against her will has a right to, he said. I have learned to knit, she said gravely. It saves lives. It does, he agreed, and went to Robb with a roll of parchment under his arm that had survived damp by stubbornness only. Riverrun holds, he said. Holds and will keep holding. The Lannisters have found the fords too dear and have settled in to starve us with their blandness. They have discovered that to be boring is not the same as to be safe. There have been songs written about it. His grin quickened. Bad ones. Songs are like children, Catelyn said. We do not always get the ones we deserve. They ate and warmed themselves, and the hall's shadows moved with the grace of old cats. Men fell into that quiet which is not silence, but an agreement to let the night do its work. Someone began a low song, and someone else forgot the next verse in a way that was both endearing and annoying. The fire ate a log in a particularly satisfying collapse. Robb sat with his back to a pillar and felt his own life as something that might be fashioned rather than given. He thought of the bridge at the Twins, and of the ribbon scratching his skin, and of gray winds steadying heat. He thought of the way the neck had eaten men that week, as if the world had decided it had been too long since it had tasted iron. He thought of two boys who may or may not have been Ash, and of a girl who might be somewhere with a wildling boy and not dead, and of a younger boy who might grow to be a man in a hall that would have to be taught again how to hold men's voices. He did not think of the red wedding because there had been no red, and there had been a wedding, and the absence of blood is not only relief, it is a debt. He owed the absence to his vow, and to a girl with careful hands, and to a mother's stare, and to a wolf who did not know about vows, but understood about kills denied and kills taken. He slept that night like a man who has put his spear beside the bed and intends to reach it if he must but trusts, for this one stretch of hours, that he will not. He dreamed, if he dreamed, of water that was not a river and of light that had no source. He woke with his mouth forming the word home again and did not scold himself for it. Morning came with clean, biting air. Robb went down into the yard and found men already there, swinging practice blades with the brisk malice of good exercise. He watched them until his breath had found the right fierceness, and then he called for a shield and took his place, because a king who does not sweat with his men is not king of anything but his own chair. He took a blow on the ribs and gave one back in exchange on the shoulder, and laughed. Bright fog and bright air, the sound startling as a boy's. He caught sight of Rosalind watching from the parapet, wrapped to the eyes, and her eyes were smiling even if her mouth was hidden. Caitlin stood a little way off, stern and fond, the way the North stands to men who serve it. The day opened its hand to them all, showing no tricks, offering nothing it had not shown before, and that was as close to mercy as winter ever gets. They would go on from there. There would be roads and knives and letters and men who were not what they seemed, and others who were exactly that, and worse. There would be a long, slow turn of the world they could not quicken by shouting. There would be moments that felt like relief and were only pauses, and moments that felt like endings and were only turns hidden by fog. For now, Winterfell stood in its brokenness and its stubbornness, and took men into itself the way a house takes in weather, with the acceptance of old stones that know what they were built for. Robb Stark leaned his weight into his work like a man leaning into wind, and found that he did not slide, and that was a beginning worth everything that had been paid to arrive at it. Snow had a way of making even ruin look deliberate. It dressed the jagged edges of blasted timber, as if some patient hand had decided to soften the splinters before they hurt a child. It laid its weight across fallen stones, as evenly as a blanket across a sleeper's shoulders, and it blurred the rawness of scorched walls into something the eye could bear. By afternoon, the storm that had flirted with the walls at first had settled into the business of falling, and men changed their gait without needing to be told, stepped a little shorter, breathed through wool, cursed less and with more purpose. Smoke went up from the forges in plumes that looked too dark against the white, like ink spilled on a page and then blown upon. The sound of hammer on iron, the good ring, and the dull thud, and the hiss where snow dared sneak in and touch a fresh hot bar, made a music that seemed older than any house name. Robb took that sound into himself, as if breath had more uses than simply keeping men alive. It kept him steady. He had spent too many weeks listening for other noises. Raider horns, the slap of oars, the flat scream of a man who knows he will not be seen again. And this had no treachery in it. He moved among the work as if a current ran beneath the snow, and he trusted it to hold him. Here was a lad filing a rivet smooth with his tongue sticking out in concentration like a child's. Here was an old man with a leather apron that had been mended so many times it had made a map of his life. Here was a girl plaiting rope with fingers that had learned to be sure and quick, not because anyone had praised them, but because the world pays more attention to the quick than to the slow. Caitlin watched with him where the yard widened, and the white laid itself undisturbed for a space no one had yet claimed. She held her hands inside her sleeves with the small economizing gesture women use when they have taught themselves that their comfort is cheaper than a fire. Snow balanced on her hair until it melted and made dark streaks on the red. She did not dislodge it. "Your father would have liked this," she said, and then smiled because she had been a wife long enough to know that men hear what they choose under such words. Not the ruin, not even the work of rebuilding. He would have liked the way men keep their heads down when hammers rise. He taught them too, Robb said. Then, because he did not care to make everything grief, he added, "Grey Wind is sulking because the cat in the kitchen swiped his nose. He will forgive by supper." "He will forget by supper," Catelyn said. "Which is not the same as forgiving. It is more practical." Her eyes traveled the yard. They did not look for anything as much as see it. "Rosalind has learned to walk on this ice. She learns what she needs," Robb said. He found her in every glance, not because he meant to, but because men are built that way when something in their life has newly changed its weight. She had wrapped herself in wolf gray wool and a hood lined with fur, the pale color of old straw. The snow did not envy her. She stood beside a cart from which a Manderly woman was handing out bowls of stew that looked scandalously rich given the winter, and she took the bowls and passed them on. And sometimes She stopped a man with a hand on his sleeve to make him look at her, while she spoke a name or a place and found that she had said it rightly. "She does not try too hard," Caitlin said, approving, which was as much praise as she gave to anyone who was not her own blood. "Trying too hard is the same as wearing too many rings. It makes a noise." Robb laughed, an honest sound. It hung in the cold a moment, as if checking to see whether laughing was allowed here, and then the wind took it and spent it on the nearest eave. "I sometimes think Baldric's thumb is the surest thing in this yard," he said, nodding to where a man with 2 fingers missing on one hand and 3 on the other set a row of rivets as if he were counting prayer beads. "Sometimes a maimed hand is the least foolish," Caitlin said. "It has learned not to reach everywhere at once." The horn from the east watch sounded once, low, not as quiet, only declaration. Men's heads lifted and then lowered again, because a yard that is rebuilding learns quickly to sort its sounds. Robb felt the small swerve of mood without letting his feet alter course. "Bolton men," a voice said behind him with the useful flatness of a man who has learned not to put vinegar in his news. "3 riders, the rest back on the road, they say. A message, and bread and salt." "Then," he nodded, already feeling the shape of words in his mouth that would be courtesy and not surrender. "See them in," he said, and then he did not wait to be stood for. He went, because men watch a king's feet to see whether they step before their heads do. Snow creaked under boots in that way it has when it has grown tired of being trod upon, and wool rasped against leather, and a horse blew out breath in a puff that shaded winter with its animal heat. The Bolton man in the lead had a face that did not decide to belong to him. It looked like one the gods had issued and expected to exchange later for one with more features. He bowed, too careful, and produced the packet of bread and the little horn of salt, as if he were handing over a child he did not like. Robb took both and broke the crust and scattered the grains. He did not have to think about such things anymore. They had become as much habit as breathing. "Lord Bolton sends his obedience and his good wishes," the man said with the pause of someone reciting from a script that would disappoint him if it changed. "And he sends this." The letter's seal was thick, white wax impressed with a flayed man who would have looked less obscene if the impressioner had been less proud of its detail. Robb felt its weight and did not let himself dislike it for being cold against his palm. He opened it in the yard because he did not choose to climb to warmth to read coal. He watched the letters resolve into Ruse's thin, steady hand. He read all the way through before letting any phrase snag him. It was a habit he had learned from Ned and then from war. The first taught you to read whole truths before choosing a part. The second taught you that the part you drop on the ground might be the one with a blade embedded in it. "It is always snow and rumor," he said when he came to the end. He handed it to Caitlin and watched the small changes in her face that only sons who had once hung on a mother's every expression can read without embarrassing themselves. "Rumor is Winter's daughter," she said. "She sits by the fire and warms her feet and tells lies that are not lies only because the world sometimes hears them and tries to make them true." He folded the letter back upon itself as carefully as if it might mind being creased in the wrong place. And when he slid it into his belt, he knew precisely where the stiff feel against his hip would land when he walked. The Bolton man watched him do this with a concentration that could be mistaken for respect, but was not. "Tell your lord that we will answer him by raven," Robb said. "Tell him his bread was fresh and his salt tasted of rock, and we thank him for both." The man bowed again, less careful this time because he could see the end of his job. He did not look at Rosalind when he turned to go, which pleased Robb in a way that made him wary of himself. He did not care to be the sort of man who counted every glance. After they had gone and the yard had poured itself back into work, Brynden Tully came up with a saddle crease in his coat that said he had ridden at a trot long enough to cool a lathered horse without a walk. His beard had held onto a fretwork of ice and snow that was already beginning to turn to droplets, and those drops made his face look younger for the moment before they slid away. "Crows along the King's Road," he said. "Can't tell yet if they're there for us or for the dead below the crust. I sent Sir Robin to chase them off and learned again how stubborn crows are when you try to shorten their dinners. Let them gorge where the bodies are not wearing our cloaks," Robb said. "We cannot keep the world tidy, only our yard." The blackfish's eyes went to the letter still shoved in Robb's belt. "Roos writes cold," he said. "He thinks warmer than he writes." "Warmth is not always mercy," Catelyn put in. And Brynden grinned at her, as if they had been speaking in a code less complicated than marriage. "True. Some men heat their knives to make them cleaner," he said. He took one step nearer and spoke lower, not secret, but neighborly. "There's a man below with hands redder than the rest. He says his name is Riswell, and he is cousin to several other Riswells, which is the sort of thing you hear and cannot check, because by the time you decide to check, the Riswells have bred again. He says the Hornwood lands are being carved like a pie. My aunt used to say she'd cut small so everyone would get a taste, and then forgot to stop cutting until there was only crumbs." "Now and..." Catelyn's mouth thinned. "Donella Hornwood died twice. A widow dies once when a man goes, and again when men see her lands as a field and themselves as plows." She turned to Robb. Her eyes hard with the kindness that makes sons bristle and then remember themselves. "You have a judgment to make there. If you put it off, Ramsay Bolton will make it for you. And his judgments are always binding because he puts no honor in them to be broken." "Menshi." Robb looked past them to the smashed gatehouse, to the way snow had settled in the twist of iron there, like a roosting bird. He could taste iron himself. "Then we will hear the claimants," he said. "We will hear them before anyone eats, and we will keep them hungry enough to be plain. They made a court, not because walls were whole and banners were handsome, but because men stand straighter when they stand before something they have all agreed is larger than them. They used a chair that had shoulders but no arms. Arms would have seemed boastful in a hall that was still more scaffolding than house. And they set it on the dais where Ned had sat, where boys had run and slipped, where ladies had walked with baskets on their arms, and learned how to be stared at without letting their spines turn to shame. Men filled the space where benches would have been, the way water fills a hollow. They stamped their feet not in impatience but to keep their toes." Reswell spoke, and so did men with names old and names new forged. The Hornwood men looked like winter-broken trees, their bark split, their sap slowed, still alive because they had taught themselves to be. Manderley had sent a cousin heavy enough to look as if he would sink into the rushes and not leave until spring. He made the argument that food follows sense. A Serwyn besides Clay said little and made his few words sit still in the air after they were said, which is a trick neither easy nor teachable. A Flint woman with a voice like a file spoke for the people who would never be invited to these arguments if they did not invite themselves. Then, inevitably, a Bolton man tried to take up more of the space than even his shadow could claim. He cleared his throat as if summoning witnesses, and when he spoke, the words structured themselves with that care men use when they hope the sentence will conceal the work done behind it. "Lady Donella died without a living child," he said. "She spoke of our house in her hour of need. Custom in the Barrowlands is..." "Custom in the Barrowlands," the Flint woman cut across, "is that wolves eat the carcass, and the bones go to barrows because no one has time to pick them clean. Custom is not a man with a knife at a widow's door." "Man, let us not paint with blood when ink will do," Robb said, and he raised one palm and the room rebalanced. "Hornwood lands are not a whore to be offered in alleys. They are men and women who need to know whose bread they will eat and whose law they will obey. I will not give them to a man who thinks law is the noise a knife makes, nor will I toss them to any lord simply because he can boast a grandfather with a louder voice than the next. Hornwood will be held in trust by Winterfell until a ward can be named from their own blood. That is more than rumor." He let his eyes find the Bolton man last. "No man calling himself Bolton, or serving one, will hold it for me." The man's face did not change. Men talk about men whose faces do not change, as if it is strength. But sometimes, it is only habit, the way ice on a pond is only habit and will break if stepped on. He bowed and his bow made all the right angles. "As you say, Your Grace," he murmured. "Ink will do," the Flint woman repeated with satisfaction. And somewhere to Robb's left the great John grunted, pleased that a quarrel had been settled with words he could lift with one hand. When the hall emptied, and men refilled themselves with stew and vices in less formal places. Caitlin let out the breath she had been saving. "That was the only answer you could give," she said. "I am glad you saw it and said it." Sometimes seeing one's answer and saying it are separate labors. "I am not eager to be Ramsay's steward," Robb said. His mouth had drawn back as if the taste of that name displeased him. He did not correct it. "If I could trim that growth without starving the tree that holds it, I would do it today." "The gods do not allow easy gardening," Brynden said behind them. "They like a man to get dirt under his nails, and then scratch his face with those same fingers, and learn what he has touched." Snow fretted at the windows, just enough that a man could pretend the day was not yet done with him. A boy came stepping careful around the corners of the dais, his hat flapping as if it did not understand its purpose. "Begging your pardon, your grace," he said, breathless with the joy of being asked to carry words. "A man at the gate who says he is black, though he is only brown to my eye. He has the look of the wall on him, and he says he knows words you must hear." "Bring him," Robb said, and Caitlin's spine reacted before her face did. The Night's Watch had the manner of gravity. You may ignore it until you drop something, and then you remember that you should have tied it down. The man who came in had that lean the wall gives men the way the sea gives sailors. Men grow their stances around the thing they serve. His cloak was patched and his hands were cracked from cold. There was no pride in him, except the right amount. Snow had lodged in his beard and had decided to remain there, as if it had not yet been introduced to fire. He bowed not as low as a court might like, and exactly as low as duty requires. "I am Hareth, called Horse," he said, and smiled a little at the name as if to admit its absurdity before anyone else could. "I bring words from Lord Commander Mormont, and from Maester Eamon. The wildlings gather thicker than flies on spilled ale. A man named Mance knits them like a woman, with too much winter left, and not enough wool." He told more. He told of shapes on the far side of the world that had been stories when they were boys, and had taken it upon themselves to step into men's campfires and instruct them in new ways of being afraid. He spoke of a battle at a place where a mountain clenched its fist around a fist of forest. A battle that had gone from confidence to scream so quickly the throat had not caught up. He spoke of ravens that had not returned, of men who had walked away from fires and had come back without their heat. His voice was ordinary, and his words were not. Caitlin did not cross herself as a septa might have. She stood steadier. "And what does the Night's Watch ask?" she said. "We have not forgotten. It is not allowed to ask much." "To be remembered," Hareth said. He did not try to make it eloquent. "To be fed when the feeding can be spared. To have witness in the south that if black banners fall, what follows will not be only raiders with knives. It will be cold with teeth." Robb felt the parts of himself that war had sharpened all lift and test the air. Men can be made nimble by fear if fear is named properly. "You shall have bread and meat, and salt, and barley and men where I can spare them," he said. "Not yet an army. I do not lie. But men from the Umber and from Bear Island, who were born to walk the woods with their eyes open. I will write to the Glovers and to the Serwins and to the Flints. If I cannot send you 100 with swords, I can send you 50 with the willingness to stand, and the sense to know when to bend and not break. And I will write to White Harbor and ask Lord Manderley to put ships where he can put them. If raiders come down the coast fleeing one enemy and looking for prettier prey, he knows how to put his hull in their way." "Bam?" Hareth bowed again, less stiff now, because where hope has been given a seat it often sits and warms itself and forgets to be formal. "The old bear will say what he always says," he murmured. "That he does not command kings and that kings do not listen to old bears. But he will be grateful all the same." "Tell him a king in the north had the good sense once to listen to a bear from the north," Robb said. And the Grey John, who had wandered near in that way he had of being where noise gathered, laughed aloud and clapped a hand against his own stomach. They saw Hareth fed in the open, because black brothers do not like private doors and warm whispered negotiations, and they sent him off with his cloak heavy with what had been tied into it. When he had gone, Robb sat a while by a window slit, where snow had pressed a little into the room, and was melting in a thin line as if the keep were weeping, and stubbornly refusing to admit it. He thought of walls and of men who stood on them, and of vows that made men turn their backs on women and pride and become something else. He thought of his father, who had taught boys in a yard to keep their sword up, not because an enemy was noble, but because an axe does not care what you think of it. "Dennis," Brynden said, as if plucking a name from the cold. "If he is not drowned in his own righteousness, he will be hungry for an ally whose word does not knot itself around his throat. He will look to the wall because there is a place there to make his banner look wise. He will write, sooner or later, to ask for the thing no king likes to ask another king for: permission to do good where the land belongs to someone else. Then, let him write," Robb said. "We will see his ink before we see his men. That will be time enough to decide whether old fires out of the south will warm a northern hall without burning it." Caitlyn's mouth did not quite smile. "You speak like a lord," she said. "Sometimes you even speak like your father." He rose. "Sometimes," he said, and it was not vanity to admit it. It was a measuring of luck and labor. "I will take men to the Dreadfort when the first break in this weather shows itself. Roose writes like ice, but the thing he writes about, boys burnt and called my brothers, does not wander your fence line like a stray dog. It is either a wolf that must be hunted or a stick someone will try to beat us into sense with. I do not like either. Better to take the stick away. Better to find the wolf and know how many teeth it is." "It will not be easy ground," Brynden warned. "Boltons are better at traps than at straight walls. And that bastard of his is a trap with legs," Caitlyn finished. And Rosalind, who had come near without thinking she was intruding, and thus had not set her own presence jangling like a man with keys, made a small sound to show that she was learning the names men used when they did not want to say the whole one. "Then we will bring the men who know how to dislike traps," Robb said. "Great John Risewells that are not cousins to themselves 3 ways. Men of the rills who walk with their feet, not their eyes. Howland Reed, if I can borrow him. If he goes where water is true, he will tangles Bolton's snares the way a woman cuts the looping thread at the end of a seam. Then Darrell." Rosalind's eyes had that carefulness he had seen the day he took her hands at the twins. "I will go to the Hornwood," she said, and Caitlyn turned toward her as a sparrowhawk might turn on a sparrow. "Not to eat, but to test its nerves." "You will go where?" Caitlyn asked, not harsh, only requiring an answer that would stand upright by itself. "To the Hornwood," Rosalind said again, keeping steady. "With women who know how to convince men to sleep and wake and eat regular, which is the only road back to themselves after men in mail have marched through their lives. I can carry letters and speak them in kitchens. I can ask a woman putting a pot on a fire who she would trust to keep the fields in furrows. I will not bring you polished men in cloaks saying the right words. I will bring you a list of names no singer will rhyme, and we will choose a steward from that list. If you send a man to the Hornwood to tell them what they are, Lord Walder will crow into his soup. If you send me, he will gnash his old teeth and say nothing, because he is too clever to admit his granddaughter chooses things now." "Ben?" Caitlyn's pause was longer than courtesy needed. It held in it a surprising thing, reluctant respect. "You will go with a guard stout enough to annoy you," she said at last. "And a maester who can write quickly what you say, and you will not let any man tell you a kitchen is only a kitchen. Prayers are muttered there that never see a sept." "I will complain about the guard," Rosalind promised. It was a joke that did not show its teeth, only its good sense. "And I will bring the names." That night, they ate a stew that had been allowed to stand and improve itself in the pot. And they listened to a singer with more nerve than voice. Men forgave him because the words had been taught to him by his grandmother, and he had not yet unlearned singing for himself. Gray Wind laid his head on his paws by the fire and looked as if he had decided to stay awake only to comfort the wood. Robb watched the logs turn to stars in ash and felt his temper ease into something you could carry for a long time without wasting it. In the morning, the cold had rearranged its opinions. It was clean and austere and honest. The sky had been washed during the night and hung dry. Robb called men with the crispness that good cold gives a voice and set out what would be done. Galbart Glover would take men to Last Hearth to ask the Umbers how many axes they could spare to walk a while in another man's woods. Mage Mormont's ravens would be harassed with letters until her daughter on the island gave up grumbling and sent warriors who would shame men into standing by standing straighter themselves. The rills would be watched, so that men who swore loyalty did not also swear to a neighboring lord the next hour. White Harbor would be bidden not only to give bread but to make winter boats that could run rivers half frozen, skimming like waterfowl, where carts would bog and men would wear out their vocabulary calling them names. They sorted companies the way women sort dried beans, by size and color and weevil bite. The Great John took a third without asking because he could not imagine that any company he led would be worse for being led by him. Roose Bolton offered 200 men to accompany Robb, and did not trouble to hide the way his mouth turned, like a knife, or a mouth of a fish. Robb accepted 100 and sent back the 100, with eyes that looked too much like their lord's to be of use in a winter, without snares. He put Risewell men under Harper Serwyn because Harper never lied to himself about what he had to work with. He let Brynden choose 10 riders who could lose a shadow, and taught them to sew strips of white fur to their cloaks, so that a man looking out from a slit in the Dreadfort would see only sky that had come down to rest on earth a while. Before they left, he went to the Godswood because some decisions ask to be seen by the faces that have seen better and worse than we think we have invented. The pool was dark as good ink, and a skin of ice had made a door across it, and then thought better of its audacity and retreated to the edges. The red leaves hung as if they were taking the weight of snow and making something elegant of it. He put his hand against the heart tree, and where bark was smooth under the snow, he felt the little movements any living thing makes when it is doing its work. He did not ask for victory. He asked to be seen and to hold steady under that seeing. When he turned away, gray wind came out from between 2 pines, as if he had never been gone. His fur had a lace of frost on it that broke and fell with every step like little spilled stars. They rode with their breath in front of them, and their intentions held close. Rosalind's party set out the same morning with less clatter and more shawls. The guard Caitlin had promised flanked her like a proper annoyance, and the maester she'd been given, thin, hopeful, careful with his ink, rode with his jaw set as if he meant to bite the cold back if it tried his teeth. Robb watched them go and did not call anything after them, because men who call after women sometimes call their own fear more loudly than their affection. He lifted a hand and Rosalind lifted hers, and the space between wagons and riders and wolves became the only measure that mattered for a time. The road east of the Weeping Water had learned new sorrows from raiders and from winter both. A farmstead lay like a handful of bones thrown down. A gate had been burned, and a child's wooden horse sat half buried in drift, as if a rider had left in a hurry and set it down to come back for it, and then had not been allowed. Men's eyes did not soften in their heads at such things. Soldiers have to graft a thin skin across what they see and make it a membrane that lets light through and keeps the dirt out, or else they execute mercy and cruelty at random until the world despises them. Robb rode at the front when the road narrowed, and let Brynden take the lead when it widened for a day, and gave the Risewells to the Great John when it ran between wind that could strip thoughts from men's heads if they weren't careful to tie them down. He did it without fuss, which is another way of saying he did it as if it had been thought about, rather than as if he felt like doing it at the time. They met 3 men with Bolton badges on a morning that bit fingers through mitts, and those men were leading a 4th bound across a mule's back like a sack of coal. The 4th had a sack over his head, and a hitch in his breath that said he had been told too often what pain will do to a man's lungs. Caught him taking a sheep, one of the Boltons said. He did not look as if he believed there was anything wrong with that, but he had learned to say so. Lord's justice is at the Dreadfort. We carry it. Your Lord's justice, Robb said mildly, is not the only justice in these parts, last I was told. Put him down. If he has to be judged with rope and witness, let it be done under the king's eyes. If he is starving and took meat to stop children from thinking their bellies are empty because they cannot imagine them full, that is another judgment I am willing to make. Men are so. The man glowered because men in ruined lands like to glower at kings. It reminds them they still have a face. We serve the flayed man, he muttered. Not the way a man boasts, but the way a man repeats an address when the wind is loud. And the flayed man will serve the direwolf while my banner flies, Robb said. There was no boast in that. only the assertion of a clause. They took the sack from the man's head. He blinked, and under the mess of beard and the grime there was a startled dignity men wear when they find themselves returned to the level ground of being looked at. He had the bones of someone who had gone hungry for more than a week and less than a winter. He made no plea. Men in the north have pride left to them even after hunger has had a bite. He named his name and his sister's and the ages of the 2 children who were not his, and yet had learned to call him that anyway. He named the sheep's owner with respect and exasperation in equal measures, and described the place where the fence had been broken by wind and not by theft. He said the word please, the way a man plants a seed in a bad field. Because the only sin is not planting it. Robb listened, and then took from his saddlebags a small coil of twine and a handful of nails and pressed them into the thief's palm. "Fix the fence first," he said. "Then take what you need and say so loudly enough to be heard. Bring 2 bones back to the man whose sheep it was when you have cooked. If you are lying to me..." He raised a hand when the man opened his mouth to swear he was not. "Do not lie today. If you are lying tomorrow, the men in red here can bring you to the Dreadfort, and I will find a rope in the Dreadfort and pull it myself if I must. I have the patience to be merciful today. Do not ask it of me twice." The man's face changed as faces do when something in the world has decided to be less cruel to them for a moment, and he could not quite bear the relief. He bowed awkwardly with his bound hands. The Bolton men looked as if some piece had been taken off their board, and they did not know whether to miss it or be glad to have one less thing to worry over. The great gent smacked his glove against his thigh. "If more men had your sense here," he told Robb, "we should grow a crop of men and not weeds." "If more men had full bellies," Brynden murmured, "we should grow fewer weeds altogether." They came on the Dreadfort like men come to an old wound. Not shy, not eager, wary, in the way a hand is wary of a scar, because it knows where it is less feeling and more. The castle hunched against sky the color of iron dust. Its towers had the look of things that would not soften even after they were dead, and sand would be made of them. The banners hung thick, the flayed men heavy in winter, as if the skin itself had become tired of being a warning. No wolves carved here, no women in shuttered windows watching like cats, no children letting the cold bite their tongues for the thrill. The Dreadfort did not breed those things in its view. Bolton men came out in order, not hurry. Their boots made a neat, ugly sound on the hard snow. The captain had eyes that had not yet learned not to show contempt, but had learned the value of keeping it under a lid. He bowed exactly the right degree lower than his lord had bowed to his king. "My lord is within," he said. "He offers you bread and salt, and a fire that uses its smoke, as quietly as smoke can be told to use itself." "We accept bread and salt," Robb said, "and we will sit at his fire and learn whether it is well behaved." They crossed a yard that did not hold the same history that Winterfell's held. There were no boys' names carved under eaves here where someone had stood on another's shoulders, no places where the rushes had been matted by children, rolling where they ought not. The stones had no mischief in them. Inside, the air was the air of a house that had never wanted to be one. Roose Bolton sat as a man will sit who does not fear being surprised, because he has given his surprise away to a part of himself that never leaves guard. "Your Grace," he said. He did not incline his head in a hurry. He had learned time's economies and used them for effect. "You come with wolves and with winter both." "I come with letters answered, and rumors to be made into truths or broken like icicles against stone," Robb said. He did not sit until bread and salt had been made as visible as a prayer needs to be. When they were brought and taken, he took the chair opposite Roose and left Brynden to stand behind his shoulder, like a man of memory, rather than a guard. He looked at the walls a moment, and let his face show appreciation without warmth. "Your men walk carefully," he said. "It is a house that teaches them to." "It is a house that has learned not to trip over its own pride," Roose returned. "Sit, eat. We will talk of boys and of ashes." They ate. The food was respectable. Meat boiled until it had forgotten its first intent. Onions that had been allowed to be themselves. A beer that had not been adulterated with anything a lord's tongue would object to. Roose did not hurry to the talk that would make the hall colder. He knew his crafts. He discussed road conditions and the way wind cuts men thin along certain reaches. if they are not merciful to themselves with wool. He asked for news of White Harbor, and did not let his voice turn when the name Manderley was said. He spoke of a healer in his house, who had learned to set bones that should not have been convinced to learn again their old habits. He spoke of this with the kind of pride that always makes sons look twice at their father's hands. Perhaps there is a gentleness in him yet, Robb thought, and then did not trust himself for thinking it. At last, because he had been too polite not to at last, Roos lifted a hand, as if reminding flies they were not wanted. Men who came across the country with nothing to recommend them but fear are a plague worse than rats, he said. They bring stories with the lice. Some are true in the way a winter is true. There is cold in them. Some are true in the way a song is true. There is a pleasing shape and nothing in your hands when the last note is gone. These came speaking of boys burned and called stark. After, men brought me 2 small bodies scorched so thoroughly that the gods would be hard put to tell which bones they had begun life with. They said they were Bran and Rickon. I do not know. I do not swear. I say only what came to my gate and how it smelled and how it lay. Men or so. Who brought them? Robb asked. He kept his voice so even it bored the sound, and so the words could run through level and leave a clear track. Men wearing fear under other men's badges, Roos said. A farmer who had cut off 2 fingers on his left hand when he was a boy, and never learned to use what was left well. A woman with a scar that meant she had once survived more fire than a kitchen uses. Reek, if you want a name that is uglier than the thing it points at, and tries to make the name the fault instead of the man. Da. Reek, Brynden said. His voice did not skid or bite. It made space. A name men give to something they do not want to look at. Names can be coats. Coats can be turned, Roos said. And there was the ghost of humor in him. I do not hang a house's future on a man called Reek. I sent for more sure words. None came. He let the smallest pause sit between them. Theon Greyjoy was in my house some months and ceased to be of use. He is no help in this matter. He is no help in any, I fear. He is soft at the center as boys are who were made to jump and did not always like it. Robb's heart made the small motion men's hearts make when a name from the sea is said inland. Theon had been a shape at Winterfell so long that it was hard to think of him as anything other than the sound of his own laughter and the smell of the river on his clothes after a horse swim. It is one thing to be betrayed by a stranger. It is another to be betrayed by the body you once knocked into as a boy, because both of you wanted to be first through a door. He lives, he said. He does, Roos said. He is not anyone's anymore. He has been anyone else too many times. He would be better dead for several reasons, but not for this one. Robb kept himself from flinching because he did not care to give the Dreadfort walls that satisfaction. And Ramsay? He asked plainly, because men sometimes deserve the courtesy of a direct knife. Roos's eyes went paler and quieter. It was his nearest thing to warmth. My bastard does what he does with such charm as he can make where charm is not wanted, he said. He made a marriage of sorts to the Hornwood with himself as bride and groom both. It is corrected insofar as such things can be called corrected. He is a valuable man to send where men must be frightened enough to remember which road goes home from a raid. He is not a man I would ask to hold a baby. You will want to see him if you want to be sure. He is behind a chore this afternoon and has no patience for other men's. I will see him, Robb said. I will see the bodies. I will see the place where they were found. I will see the man called Reek if he still walks. I will see the path out of your gate and whether it has a shape that looks like 2 small boys being guided at dusk by someone with more sense than mercy. None. Roos inclined his head with that precise courtesy that suggests teeth being counted. We will show you everything we have, and everything we have not thought to hide, he said. You will not be satisfied. No man is when the information he wants will not make itself into a weapon he knows how to wield. Then, they went to the cold room where the bodies lay. The air there had been taught to be still. The table had been scrubbed so hard that someone had taken the top layer of wood off it. The wood looked embarrassed by being so clean. The shapes upon it were smaller than grief expects. Cloth had been laid with an instinct learned in other rooms on kinder business. Someone had cut the cloth too smoothly and then had to tear the last bit with their hands. Robb stood and made himself look. He let his eyes be honest and kind, without being sentimental. Sentimentality is a kind of theft at tables like this. They are boys, he said. That is certain. They are not boys who were fed well. That is also certain. The world has a surplus of such truths. Caitlin was not there. She had said, "I am not a mother here," and then had had the sense to add, "Not with my eyes." Brynden stood and made himself stone, so that Robb could stand and make himself a man. Roose watched them both, and watched the watching, as if he were reading a hand at dice. "Where?" Robb asked at last. His voice had turned the tone wood takes in winter. "In a cart with turnips and turnip smells?" Roose said. "On the road east." The men who brought them said they had been lifted from a hollow where the ground had not frozen properly because something dark was under it. They said a man had told them a story by a fire that went like this and like that, and bent the way men bend stories when they distrust their audience. Robb set his hands on the edge of the scrub table and let the cold of the wood pass into his palms until it stung, and then until it merely existed. "I want to hear that man's version," he said. "I want to hear the road's version if it will tell it. I want to hear the crows. I want Howland Reed to tell me whether the mud kept anything it should not have. I want—" He stopped and made himself choose a word that would walk in boots. "I want not to be made a fool by hope or despair. So I will be made a fool by work for a week first." Roose's mouth almost smiled and then decided not to. "We can arrange work," he said. They did. The next days laid out like planks on frozen river, each one hammered into place before the next foot could be set. They questioned with the patience of a man picking splinters from a child's thumb, slow enough not to drive them deeper. The man called Reek laughed high at first and then low, and his laugh did less to conceal him than he thought. He smelled of old water and new fear. He told 5 stories and contradicted all of them, and then told a 6th that borrowed the truth from the first and the second, and set them down as if they had been keeping his seat. He said the names of trees as if giving nicknames to enemies. He swore the little bodies had been the Stark boys because men had said they were, and men sometimes get tired of not agreeing with one another. He said Theon had been there, and had not, and had been both, which even in the Dreadfort was too much to be allowed. Howland Reed came when Robb wrote the way a man writes to a friend who lives in an element that does not obey letters. He slid into the Dreadfort as if water had taught him where to put his feet on stone. He nodded to Roose as if nodding were the same language in all places, and then he went to the room where the bodies lay, and he laid his hand down on the boards near where a shoulder blade made its small, stubborn slope beneath claw. He did not touch the bodies until he had given them more world to lie in with his attention. "It is difficult to make a truth stay put once fire has walked over it," he said. He lifted the corner of a cloth and looked as men look at a map they hope will blur into what they want a country to be. "It is not these boys to my eye. I do not swear it. I would stake bread and meat on it and be a little hungry, but not starving if I were wrong. Which is the most honest way I can say it." "How?" Brynden asked. "When they are ash and bone and guess. The way a bog keeps secrets," Reed said mildly. "By remembering what pressed into it earlier. There are scars along the long bones that are not these boys. These are small men's scars, the kind peasants' sons get when they have to learn to carry more water than they can at 7, and drop it at 9, and get beaten for it, and learn to lift it at 11 with their backs bent. Stark boys get other scars. They learn where a saddle rubs. They learn how a wooden sword paired with another boy's can kiss the knuckles and lay them open. They learn frostbite at the edges where fathers are careful, not at the center where they are not. These are not those." "Ben?" Roose's eyes did not move, only narrowed. "You argue from ghosts, Crannogman," he said. "I argue from the mud," Reed answered, as politely as a man tells a lord his boots are on the wrong feet. "I argue from the way a child's body talks to your hands if you have been allowed to hold enough of them without being told to stop." Robb did not let relief run up him. He allowed it to sit near his knees and warm them. "Then we still look," he said. "We look with better news than we feared. We look with more hunger than a man has for a lie." Roose provided quarters that were exactly as warm as they needed to be, and no warmer. He provided men whose faces were blank as polished spoons, and whose eyes noticed the edges of things first. He did not provide his bastard. Ramsay remained a rumor in his own house, and when Robb asked a stable boy with hair, the color of chaff and eyes like a rabbit's, whether he had seen the man, the boy said, "He comes and goes," in a tone that meant the boy had taught himself he would live longer if he did not notice. On the fourth day, a hunter from the rills who wore a hood, lined with the fur of 3 different animals, brought in 2 boys' shoes. He set them down on the table, with the air of a man giving a cat a fish it will play with first and eat later. He said he had found them in a briar thicket that had kept more secrets than it intended. The shoes were small and cunningly made. They were not noble. They were not cheap. They had been made by a man who had half loved the work and then had to hurry it to finish the day's bread. Reed turned one in his hands and looked up, when Robb did not trust his own breath enough to look down. "Not Stark," Reed said. He did not smile because he had too much tenderness to make easier things harder by being pleased. But Stark-tied, as everything in this land is when men say, "boy," and think of one face, because they miss him. They did not find Bran. They did not find Rickon. They found places where you might take a boy through without fearing a horse would pierce the snow and go up to the withers. They found a brace of hares with their throats neatly broken and hung in a place where a child could not reach without help. Men do such things to make the world seem more orderly in the midst of danger. They found an old woman's fire burned low and her ashes too clean. Robb left food and a knife, even though the woman had likely left for the woods to die in a way that would not trouble anyone's housekeeping. They found a cairn turned over by a man who thought he might find a ring and did not. They found the way the North keeps its own counsel, even when asked politely. In the Dreadfort's yard, 2 men fought with blunted axes, and the sound had a harder edge than swordstick on shield, like 2 doors being closed on one another's fingers. The Great John laughed and shouted instruction that contained more weather than technique. Reswell men watched with their mouths open, in the casual way of Northerners, who expect to be amused for free and are not shy of letting a man know when he has failed in that. Robb watched too, because watching men fight is a form of respect, and because a king must sometimes be seen, so that his soldiers remember he is not only a letter and a rumor and a taxed meal. He found, unexpectedly, that the walls at his back did not itch as he stood. He had expected the Dreadfort to make his shoulders think of knives. It made him think of winter cupboards instead, bare and clean and necessary. His distrust did not lessen. It merely found a different shape. He stores fear the way a good house stores flour. He thought of Roose, in cool, dry rooms where it does not mildew and go to waste. When he went to take his leave at last, because there are better ways to spend men than guarding a lord who will not betray himself until he is ready. Roose walked with him to the gate with that grace men have when they do not mind that their shadows move ahead of them and do not fear stepping in them and tripping. "Your Grace," he said, and paused because what he wanted to say next was not in any speech book. "There are men here who will never wear your badge with love. There are men here who will wear it because it is the only badge that keeps snow from their throats. There are men here who will wear it because they hate the men who do not wear it more than they hate having to wear anything. They will do. You cannot ask for all love. It makes a soft army. Men show. I have no need of softness," Robb said. "I ask for obedience, and for men not to lie to themselves so often that they forget what lies look like." Roose's eyes narrowed again, pleased as a cat that has decided a lap contains a lap, after all. "Then we understand each other," he said. "Your mother," he added after a step, "wields a courtesy that could flense a man in thinner strips than my badge boasts. She learned from men who thought courtesy a game you play in front of fires," Robb said. "She learned it is a shield and a knife both. They parted with neither warmth nor formal chill, and both were better for it." When the party rode out through the Dreadfort's gate, the air had that scent it sometimes gets in the north, a metal tang like a coin held in the mouth. Grey Wind had not liked sleeping there, and did not pretend to have liked it. He went ahead of the riders, as if to clear the air, and when he reached the first stand of pines, he dropped his head and ran in a long, low line that made men straighten in their saddles, without knowing why. They did not take the straightest road back. Straight roads in the north are invitations to be counted. They took the line that went along a ridge where the wind sanded men to their bones, and then down into a bowl, where the snow had lain deep and quiet since the first fall and was offended to be broken. They lost a shoe on a horse, and an hour in a hollow and a day, to a load of timber that had to be pulled out of a drift, if men were not to believe the world left work half done. Robb did not curse any of it. He had learned that curses are salt the wind steals and brings back to you in your own mouth. At a crofter's place where the roof slanted as if bowing to the old oak beside it, and the door had been mended with boards from 2 different barrels, they found a boy whose hair stuck up in cowlicks like winter grasses. He had a stick and a wooden soldier, and he had learned to make the soldier limp with an excellence that made the Grey John wince, and then nod, because if boys were going to learn to play at wounds, they should learn to do it accurately. The boy stared at Robb as boys stare at large animals and kings, weighing the likelihood that such creatures will be as interesting as he has heard. "You are not so big," he pronounced at last. "I am as big as my horse," Robb said, striving for solemnity, and the boy considered. "Horses are big only when they step on you," he decided. "My mother says kings are big when they eat. Will you eat here?" "If your mother asks me to," Robb said. "She tells men what to do," the boy informed him, satisfied. "She says when men stop telling her what the world is like, she remembers it. She says the world does not like being told." "I have met the world," Brynden put in gravely. "It is rude when corrected." They ate porridge sweetened with preserved blackberries that tasted like summer boots, and laughter that had been carried through months and had not spoiled. They left a ham because they had more hams than this house did, and because men who leave a ham behind often find their beds warmer later than the ham could have made them. Which is not superstition, but arithmetic. Robb went out after to piss where he would not offend anyone, and found himself standing in a sprinkle of hail that made the air taste like the time he had licked a nail as a boy to see whether the iron had a flavor. Grey Wind pushed his head under Robb's hand and brought him back to himself and the cold. They came into Winterfell with the cold on their faces like paint that would not rub off, and men turned and lifted mugs and showed their teeth and put their hands to their mouths and shouted, because shouting makes men feel as if their bodies are larger and can hold more news. Catelyn met them in the gatehouse with a hood thrown back the way women throw back a hood when they need to see more and do not care if snow thinks it can have its way with their hair. Roslyn was not there. She had sent a letter ahead with a rider who had gone through 2 horses, because his mother had told him when he was a boy that when men are told to ride hard for women, they should listen. The letter had not made flourishes. The maester's hand was neat and fast, and lacked artifice and compassion both, which meant Roslyn had made him rewrite 3 lines so the words would not read like a ledger. She had gone to the Hornwood and had not come back only because there were women there who had drains to clear, and tears to stop, and hunger to be turned into work, and she had not wanted to bring them to Winterfell where their labor would be admired and wasted. She had sent names of men who were not grand, and names of women who were not asked. She had sent 3 children's ages, and who they called father, and the answer to the problem of the Mill Creek, that had done a sly thing and forked itself under the frost, and eaten a wheel from below, while men were praising their own forethought for having set the wheel up high. "She will be back in 2 days, the letter ended, with a practical lie. "It meant soon enough that I am not an adventurer, and not far enough that you will worry more than is proper for a husband, to worry about a wife who is doing good work." Catelyn had read it, and the corner of her mouth had done that unruly thing again. "She is not a punishment," she had said aloud in the room where no one had asked her to think kindly, and she had thought kindly anyway. "She is a lesson I might have chosen for you if the gods had asked my opinion and promised to behave afterward." Robb stood in the courtyard and took off his glove, and let the cold bite the skin on the back of his hand, because sometimes the simplest sensations are the ones that make men remember where they are. The godswood behind him rattled its red leaves with their quiet paper conversation. A raven dropped onto the post near the stable and made a sound like an old hinge being corrected. He went inside, and the heat lifted around him like a welcome, and he let his face show that welcome, and then subside into work, as faces must. Work received him as if it had missed him. There were stores to count and letters to open and close and send again in different dresses. There were quarrels to arbitrate where both men were wrong, and only one had learned to be loud about it. There were spears to look down the line of and tears to allow in small rooms and put a hand on and then go. There were birds to speak to and goats to coo at, so the children would see that kings know the names of things that feed them. There was a moment to rest the crown in his hands again and feel its metal cold and not put it on, and then to put it on, because he had to, and feel the way his head learned the weight again without complaint. When Rosalind returned, the yard pretended it had not been waiting to see whether she would do so, with a fuss that would annoy the men who dislike female arrivals. She dismounted with hands that had learned the horse's ways better, and a back that had learned not to be proud about the way cold stiffens it. Her cheeks were chapped to a lovely anger. She handed over a satchel with lists that would have been too long had she not learned to be practical. And she kissed Robb's cheek, because the world will take more from men if their faces are strange to kisses. She smelled of smoke, and porridge, and river water, and wool that has finally dried in a cold room. The hornwood will not be stolen this winter, she said, as if reporting a roof had been mended. In spring perhaps men will try again. In spring the women there will have hoed their grudges into the rows, and it will be more difficult to pull them up. They have chosen a steward. He is not clever. He is not cruel. His hands are cracked, and he thinks slowly. He is correct. Caitlin nodded, as if measuring the seam. We will write his name down so the gods will have to make an effort to forget it and fail, she said. And we will tell men who think themselves clever that cleverness is too thin to stand winter. I am glad you did as you did. Rosalind smiled, not at praise, at usefulness. Howland Reed says the boys were not the boys, she added quietly when the talk turned to casks and salted meat. He says the mud told him so. I do not know how mud speaks, but when he says it does, I find I am willing to ask it questions. Then we will keep asking, Robb said. We will ask the mud. We will ask the wind when the wind is too tired to lie. We will ask women who do not like to be asked and boys who like to be asked too much. They ate then with the appetite of men who have been about work that asked their whole day and did not overpraise themselves for giving it. The hall was not grand. It did not need to be. Laughter propped the beams better than carved mantles do, and breath kept the tapestries on the walls from stiffening into self-importance. A Manderley man told a joke about a sailor and a goat that made Robb's ears go hot because it was filthy and wholesome both, and Caitlin laughed in spite of herself, and then pretended she was laughing at the way the Great John's ears had gone hot, and not Robb's. Bryndon sang a verse of some Riverlands march that put such tenderness into the business of going away that men had to look at the fire or at their own boots to keep their faces in order. Afterward, in the small chamber that had learned to be a bedchamber again by recalling the habit, Rosalind showed Robb a bruise she had got where a door had decided it was more important than her shoulder. He kissed it, and she made a wry face and said, "Do not make poetry of my door." He did not. They lay and listened to the wind pull at the shutters, as if they were friends who had quarreled and would reconcile at dawn. He slept with his hand on the sheet, the way he had when he was a boy, and needed to feel the ordinary weight of linen to make the night's shapes behave. Morning had a thin ice of gray on it, and then sunlight that colored itself with gold, because it had learned from men that to be beautiful, you must have more than one hue. A raven brought a letter stamped with a 7-pointed star, and written in a hand that had learned sanctimony the way a woman learns to knead bread. Both tasks make forearms strong and temper wry. The High Septon, or someone wearing his voice like a hood, called him traitor, and suggested that a crown in the north was a blasphemy against crowns elsewhere. The letter suggested mercy would follow obedience the way a dog follows meat. Robb wrote back with all the care his mother had taught him for words that will be read by enemies and then passed around to friends. He said the gods did not appoint crowns. Men did, and took them away. He said the 7 might have their place, and so did the old tree that had learned to watch. He did not write anything a singer would copy down for its grace. He wrote things a man would keep and reread when he needed to be sure of his own stance. He sealed it with the running wolf and did not send bread and salt with it. Letters do not eat. He wrote to Ednure and told him what wall men had said, and what Hornwood women had decided, and how platters were filled and emptied here. He wrote to Wyman Manderley and asked him to sharpen his cleverness and dull his appetite for theater. Until spring, because the North could only bear so much shared laughter when fences were still being mended with twine and goodwill. He wrote to Lady Mage and called her the bear in ink with a fondness he would deny if asked, and he asked for women to stand behind walls where men stand, because walls cannot always tell the difference between who holds them and who holds them together. He wrote to a name he did not say aloud, Stannis, which tasted like iron and old justice, and said that if the man came to the wall to be useful, the North would consider half forgiving him his southernness. He wrote to no Frey but Roslin, which was a courtesy and a warning both. And he sent her grandfather a letter that used the least words possible and contained none of the ones he loved to twist. On a day that began with gulls heard far inland as if they had decided to holiday on the ice, a party came into the yard with banners that had been mended more than once in the same places. The Karstark sunburst came with them, and Rickard Karstark himself rode under it like a man who had taught himself to become thinner rather than bend. He had his jaw set, and his eyes were like old ice against stone. He dismounted with a stiffness that was not age and not injury. It was a way of standing that men learn when they have persuaded themselves that if they move in any other way, they will fall apart. He bowed enough to keep the world spinning, and then he said, "You have not hanged the king's lair. You have not sent his head to me pickled in brine. You have not used him to bash in the doors of your grief and mine. You have married a Frey. You have forgiven many things. You have not forgiven enough." "Jaime Lannister's at River Run," Robb said, under guard that has learned to enjoy the idea of breaking his bones if he turns his head without permission. "He is more useful to us warm than cold. I have not forgiven him anything. I have used him for my own ends because that is what men do with enemies. I married to prevent a different war. I will not ask you to be pleased. I will ask you to be practical." Karstark's mouth made a shape as if the word tasted like southern bread. "Sugared and untrustworthy. My boys are dead," he said. He did not weep, because men who have taught themselves to do anything with their faces in the North seldom weep where it makes a difference. "Every morning I wake up and remember it the way a man remembers he once had a tooth and his tongue goes there and finds the hole and worries it. I am more useful angry than sad. Put me anywhere a man needs killing that is not a child and not a woman and not a man with his hands tied. Let me do work, your grace, that will not make my sons ashamed to watch." Robb felt, not for the first time that day, that the air had a flavor of iron filings. He nodded once. "I have need of a man to take grim work into the wolf's wood and keep Ironborn from thinking winter weakens us," he said. "I have need of a man who will teach boy soldiers how to be men without lying to them that it is noble and without telling them it is shameful. I have need of a man who will learn to think past his own pain long enough to keep other men from falling into theirs. I do not ask you to be whole first. I ask you to break things that are worth breaking." Karstark's shoulders moved. It could have been a shiver. It could have been a prayer. "I will bring you heads with beards full of salt," he said. "I will bring you quiet ridges where only the wind makes sound, and men learn it is theirs again." "Do not bring me boys' heads," Robb said. "Do not bring me men's heads that were tied down when you cut them. I will hang you for those as sure as I would hang any. Your grief does not make your hands law." Karstark's eyes went to him and sharpened, and then, perhaps surprisingly, they softened. "If you hang me for such, hang me for good cause," he said. "I am tired of bad causes." When he had gone, Catelyn let her hands drop from where she had had them folded. "He wanted to force you to say it," she said. "He wanted to force you to say you would hang him as easily as any man. It is a kind of mercy when men ask to be ruled." "It is a kind of laziness," Brynden muttered. "But it makes the world turn more smoothly some days. He will not be your problem while he has work. He will be your problem the first quiet hour." "I will not leave him many quiet hours," Robb said. "I will not leave myself many either." The hours he allowed himself were not quiet. They filled with the small weights he had learned to love because they were honest. He stood with men at the practice butts and learned from a boy how the leather on a new glove rubs the base of the thumb and how to loosen it with fat and patience. He sat at a window while a girl who had a voice like nettles and honey sang a lay about a fox who married a goose and then had to endure a winter of being reminded of his poor choice by every crow on the hill. He walked the wall with gray wind and counted the lamp niches, so that if a fire came, he would know where to shout for the next spark. He stood with Rosalind by the kitchen and learned which loaves would go to the guard towers, because they kept longer, and which to the sick rooms, because they were soft and would not tear a mouth that had split in the cold. When the letter came with a hand like bony fingers, Stannis, through a man too proud to disguise his master's pride, Robb read it twice and then a third time aloud to a room that held Catelyn and Brynden and Wyman Manderly's cousin, who was in want of flattery and not getting it. Stannis spoke of king's duties and God's indifference in lines on old maps that had once meant something before men stopped tracing them. He spoke of the wall and of the South's ingratitude, and he asked in every word without asking once, "Will you stand aside while I do thing?"